Thank you very much, Dean Liao, and thank you for this opportunity to share some of my thoughts on this big subject. Maybe sensitive, I don't know. I just had a couple of drinks, so I don't know what sensitivity is about. But what I'm going to say, I want to put it out at the beginning, are my personal views, not those of the institutions that I'm supposed to work for. So these are personal and having nothing to do with my government. I think I'll try to address three questions. One is how should one view the current transition of power in the Asia-Pacific region? Second, how has it impacted on regional security? And finally, what to do to look for the future? Before talking about the transition of power, maybe we should define what we mean by power. The question is, do the Chinese have a different concept of power? Since I'm talking from a Chinese perspective. I don't think so. Now, people talk a lot about soft power in addition to hard power, as if soft power is something that we had not thought about before. Okay? A new, discovery of the time. The fact is, the Chinese have talked about soft power as well as hard power thousands of years ago, even though we have not used the exact terms. For example, more than 2,000 years ago, political advisors in different Chinese kingdoms fought over whether their leaders should practice 霸道, rule by force, or 王道, rule by moral influence, or the king's way. As Mencius once put it, people in the 70s have clothes to wear and meat to eat. Ordinary people suffer from neither hunger nor cold. If the ruler can accomplish this, he should surely win the hearts and minds of the people. Here we are talking about attractions, moral attractions, some kind of a soft power. Right? If there is a distinction between traditional Chinese conceptualization of power and the current conceptualization of it, it is about the importance of the institutions we attach to when we talked about the soft power, in addition to the attraction of morality and practice, as the Chinese did in the old days. How should we view the current transition of power in the region after we clarify the concept of power? Viewed in terms of the two aspects of power, the power transition in the Asia-Pacific region is by no means complete. Actually, I would argue that it is an ongoing process that is still full of uncertainties. On top of that, the future development may not be a linear one. Since 2008, it has become quite popular to claim that China will take over the US and become the next superpower soon. However, most serious people, both in China and outside China, only go so far as to argue that China will overtake the US economically. That is, in terms of GDP per capita, or PPP, or by old exchange rate methods. Very few serious people think about China has or will, in the foreseeable future, take over the United States economically. Professor Hu Andong, my friend, of Tsinghua University is perhaps one of the few most optimistic among the Chinese informed community. In this regard, he has argued that China has already taken over, but very few people appear to share his view. Personally, I think despite the rapid and sustained economic growth of China during the past decades, the gap between China and the United States remains huge. Economically, although the size of the GDP is approaching to that of the United States, China is behind the United States on many other aspects of the economic issue. Politically and militarily, the gaps are also big, if not bigger. On soft power, there is no basis of comparison. I think China is nowhere near the United States in this regard. Whether China will be able to close the gaps anywhere soon, I think the chance is there, but it is very small. Given the many advantages the hegemonic state enjoys, it is much more difficult for the rising power to surpass the hegemonic power than many assume. In the post-World War II history, there were several occasions in which rising powers were expected to surpass the United States, such as the Soviet Union in the 1960s and Japan in the 1980s. And each time, you hear Americans voice their concern. However, each time it turned out rather differently than people had expected. Will this time be different? As a Chinese, I hope so. However, as a scholar, I have to be realistic about it. Some people say that this time is different because unlike the Soviet Union, China's economy is strong and dynamic, so it can back up its rights. And also, unlike Japan, China has strategic depth as a continental country and largely independent defense industry to realize its ambitions. To some extent, these arguments are valid. However, they are not sufficient to persuade us that the Chinese case will be that exceptional. Ultimately, I believe whether China can surpass the United States depends on how it conducts itself, both at home and abroad, and it is too early to tell the result at the moment. At home, this means whether the Chinese Communist Party will be able to implement the reforms it proposed in the third and fourth plenum resolutions of the 18th Party Congress. Abroad, it means whether China will successfully adapt to the broad trends of history and its newly acquired identities, define its interests accordingly, and use its power, growing power, wisely with caution and deference. Between these two, the most important, I think, is how China conducts itself at home. Because I believe that the reform measures proposed in the third and fourth plenum of the 18th Party Congress are so intrinsically good and sensible that if they get fully implemented, China would have become another and much better country. A country that both the Chinese and people outside the world, outside China, would like to have. So far, we have just talked about the transition of power between China and the United States, not other countries like Japan, India, and other countries. I know it's not fair, particularly India. I think India's rise will have profound implications for the region as well. However, given the limited time I have to focus on the most important aspect now, since India's rise just took off and may be too early to assess its implications fairly. What does the power transition mean for the region? Although the power transition remains an ongoing process, it already has serious impact on the security of the region. To begin with, Chinese find it more and more difficult to define China's interests as a result of rise of China. China has undergone some drastic and fundamental transformations over the decades. As a result, China's identities have been changing. It is no longer the same revolutionary power, the same poor and backward and weak country of the past. At the same time, it is not quite a status quo power. It is not quite a rich, advanced, and strong country yet. It is somewhere in between. It is neither, it is both. As a result, China is facing a problem of dual identities and interests. In terms of identities, among other things, China is both a developing country and developed country at the same time, both a poor country and a rich country at the same time, both a weak country and a strong country at the same time, and both an ordinary country and a superpower at the same time, or maybe future superpower at the same time. Identity defines interests. If identity defines interests, China has interests of both a developing country and a developed one, both a poor country and a rich one, both a strong country and a weak country and a strong one, both an ordinary country and a superpower. The coexistence of two identities and interests in many issues has created much confusion for the Chinese to define China's interests and sort through their values and priorities. If defining national interests is a serious challenge for all countries, it is an impossible task for China. In sum, suffering from identity conflict, China finds it hard to define its interests and values. This has broad implications for China's foreign policy behavior. That explains the increasing inconsistency and incoherence in Chinese foreign policy behavior in recent years, making it difficult for the outside world to understand China at a time when they most want to. In the second place, with China's rise, increasing number of Chinese begin to think China is strong enough to take a more proactive approach to defend China's own legitimate interests. They had been told by the Chinese government that China could not take tougher measures in this regard because China was weak. They argue that China is not that weak now. Why don't we take tougher positions? It is against this background that the Chinese government has taken tougher positions on a range of issues. Territorial disputes, history, and even U.S. naval and air military and reconnaissance activities close to China's coast. By the way, China's tough position did not start with President Xi Jinping, who is known for his toughness as a leader. It began earlier. In the third place, confronted with the situation, some countries which have problems with China one way or the other, such as territorial disputes or historical interpretation, have become more concerned about the implications of China's rise on their security interests. Accordingly, they have found good reasons to enhance their security relations with the United States. In the fourth place, China's proactive approach in the South China Sea and East China Sea has led some Americans to believe that the US has to do something to maintain its international credibility, especially its alliance commitments. As a superpower, the US can only protect and advance its own interests through maintaining the international order. Since maintaining international order is a very costly business, the US needs other countries, especially its allies, to help defray the cost. It therefore feels necessary to demonstrate its willingness to help protect the alleged legitimate interests of its allies. This explains why the US sent warships and military aircrafts to the South China Sea to do the so-called freedom of navigation patrols, despite its damaging impact on China-US relations. In the fifth place, as some Chinese neighbors and the US hedge against China in their respective ways, Chinese feel threatened. Some think that Professor Mearsheimer, the guy who is a self-claimed offensive realist, some Chinese begin to think that John Mearsheimer is right and the Thucydides trap is unavoidable. The US cannot tolerate China's rise. It is containing China by pivoting to Asia and prodding Chinese neighbors to encroach China's interests. Therefore, China is left with no choice but to prepare for an eventual showdown with the US. In the sixth place, some power transitions in the region will take some time to, since the power transition in the region will take some time to complete, the current level of mistrust and tension is likely to continue, if not getting worse, in the foreseeable future. Hence, brace up for a tough ride. Finally, probably more important, but unfortunately less talked about, is that we have focused too much on the South China Sea and East China Sea events. As a result, there is lack of attention to other, probably more important security threats to the region, namely extremism, lower thresholds for military conflicts as a result of technological achievements, lack of willingness on the part of the great powers to cooperate in defense of the existing international security order. So we have a lot of problems like terrorism, cybersecurity problems, drone threats, nuclear proliferation, and maritime disputes. Well, I just gave you a gloom and doom picture of the situation. Maybe we should not be too pessimistic about it. I'll give you some good news. Here are some good news. The first piece of good news is that the Thucydides trap may not be the right term to describe the relations between rising powers and the hegemonic powers. It is too simplistic for understanding of the full complexities of the relationship between the power transition and war. According to Thucydides, the rise of Athens and the Spartans' fear of being taken over led to Peloponnesian War. Hence, power transition and related fear on the part of the hegemonic power explain the outbreak of war between the rising power and the hegemonic power. In history, however, we can also find instances in which the rising power and the hegemonic power coexisting in peace during power transition, such as the US during the latter part of the 19th century, and Japan and Germany after the Second World War. What then is the factor that makes peaceful coexistence between the rising power and the hegemonic power possible. All countries seek power and welfare as they rise. However, there are two different ways of seeking them. One is through military territorial expansion. The other is through trade and economic relations. Comparing the cases of non-peaceful power transitions and cases of peaceful power transitions in history, we find that in the former case, the rising power relied on war and territorial expansion for welfare and international prestige, whereas the latter on trade and economic relations. Therefore, it is the way the rising power rises that determines whether the power transition is peaceful or not. If this is the case, one should be rest assured that China's rise should be peaceful. This is because China has relied on trade and economic relations for expansion during the past decades, and is likely to do so in the future. On territorial issues, I think there is a lot of misunderstanding of China's policy. Some people say that China is becoming expansionist. The fact is, first, China has not engaged in territorial expansion so far, and not likely in the future. Second, China, during the past decades, has tried to fix its borders through negotiation and dialogue, despite the fact it's a rising power. Thirdly, what China claims in the East and South China Sea are not what China has always claimed in the past, just as some other countries have always claimed pieces of the South China Sea. So there is nothing new. The second pieces of good news is that the world has changed significantly from that of the 19th century. Now we have nuclear weapons. Ever since we had nuclear weapons, the nuclear weapon states do not fight each other because it doesn't make sense. Second, there has been growing opposition to the use of force. Use of force, people, earlier today, we heard Professor Mabubani, who was talking about the paradigmic change in people's perception of the utility of wars. Used to be a glorious thing, now it's not. It's no longer. And thirdly, globalization has reached to the extent that now you have alternatives to get welfare and international prestige. The United States used economic trade and economic relations to reach a superpower status in a way. And Japan and Germany, after the Second World War, became great again, not because they were strong militarily, but because they were strong economically. So you have alternatives to do that. As a result, it does no longer pay for military territorial expansion, and there is a viable alternative for the rising powers to seek welfare and prestige through international trade and economic relations. The third piece of good news is that China's transition is still largely in the right direction. More developed, richer, stronger, and more stakes in the existing international order. If interests shape foreign policy behavior, China is more likely to act in a way that the world expects China. Finally, the fourth piece of good news is that there are still many good-hearted people in all of our countries in the region. They subscribe to shared interests and noble aspirations of peace, stability, and common prosperity instead of conflict of interest and ambitions for domination. And they want to work together rather than against each other in our search for a better future. I believe that APPSMO is perhaps precisely an effort by these people in Singapore, and I congratulate them for doing it. And I wish to take this opportunity to congratulate the organizers and participants for engaging in this good process. Taken these together, I suppose we can be cautiously optimistic about the future. Last Friday, I had a meeting with Deputy Prime Minister Jia Qingguo. He asked me what makes me optimistic about the future of the region. I guess it is in part because of the reasons I just mentioned, the pieces of good news. And also in part because as a die-hard optimist, I still have faith in humanity. Thank you for your attention.